My name is Olivia Harper. I'm 27 years old, and I live in Portland, Oregon. If you had met me a year ago, I might have told you that I had everything figured out. A junior brand strategist job at a small agency on SE Belmont, a tidy studio apartment with a fern I kept alive against all odds, a circle of friends who preferred pour-over coffee and careful conversation. I would have told you I was independent. I might have even used that proud word, self-made, though you and I both know how often that phrase leaves out an entire story of hands that lifted us when we were too young to stand. And yet, if you had asked about my father, I would have changed the subject. I had learned to perform that magic trick, vanish a man out of my life with a shrug. Maybe you know that feeling. Maybe there's someone in your family you mention in past tense, as if past tense could protect you. You don't say their name because you think the syllables will summon something heavy. You don't tell the whole truth because it's messy and unflattering, because it reveals a version of you that you'd rather not introduce to the room. My father's name is Daniel Harper. He is 61. For most of my life, he worked at a garage outside Eugene, a one-story building with a tin roof that whistled when it rained. He kept wrenches on hooks and duct tape in his back pocket. His hands were the kind that left a charcoal shadow on everything they touched: door handles, receipts, my forearm when he, steadying me as a little girl, hopped off a high curb. If you've never known a man who carried his living in his hands, you might misread the stains as indifference. Oil doesn't wash out easily, neither do judgments. People at the agency like to ask what our parents do. It's a social game we play without realizing it, like comparing shoes or renting prices. At a coworker's birthday last spring, someone turned to me and said, "And your parents?" The room smelled like lemon cupcakes and bergamot candles. It would have been easy to say, "My dad is a mechanic," which is not a confession, just a fact. But I felt the old heat rise in my face, the way it always did when I sensed I was being measured against a scale I didn't build. I heard myself say, light and quick, "My mom passed when I was 20, and my dad, he's retired now." I brushed it off like lint. I sipped my drink. I smiled. The conversation drifted away, and with it, a small piece of honesty. That night, I went home and stared at my reflection in the window, the city lights layering over my face. If you've ever blurred the truth about someone who loves you, you know the ache that arrives afterward, like a late bill reminding you of a debt unpaid. We tell ourselves it's harmless. We say, "It's just easier." We say, "No one needs all the details." But easier has a cost. It shaves away the person we might have become if we had chosen courage. I didn't stop at small omissions. I deleted my father's number from my favorites. I stopped returning calls. On holidays, I sent a text, "Hope you're well," as if the entire history of a family could be reduced to a sentence. When he left longer voicemails, halting updates about the house, about the neighbor's new dog, about a clanking noise in the truck, I listened to them in the kitchen and let the counter hold me up. I would promise myself I'd call back after work, then after dinner, then after the weekend, then never. You might think a daughter needs a good reason to cut her father out of her life. I did have reasons, at least the kind that make tidy stories. A childhood spent with a man who didn't speak the language of feelings, a house where silence often won, a grief that found no place to sit after my mother died. When I was 20, Mom's heart failed in the quiet of an August afternoon. She had been the translator between my father and me, the one who turned his grunts into jokes, who filled in the colors of our monochrome days. When she left, we were two islands facing each other across a fog. The week after the funeral, Dad stood in the kitchen with his hands open, as if waiting for directions. People kept bringing casseroles in foil pans. The refrigerator hummed with pity. I wanted him to say something that a man in a movie might say, something about how we'd get through this together, how he had always loved Mom, how he'd love me double now to make up for the empty chair at the table. He didn't say any of those things. He stood at the sink and washed the same dish twice. He packed up Mom's scarves in a box without asking me which ones I wanted to keep. He didn't cry in front of me, which at 20 felt like cowardice and now feels like self-preservation. Grief narrates itself in myths. Mine said he couldn't even love her right. It wasn't true, but it was clean. It gave me something to hold when everything else slipped through my fingers. I left for college and then for a job. The miles gave me permission to redraw the map. You start with the big strokes, new city, new friends, and soon the absences feel intentional, even noble. You say you're focused, driven, busy. None of those words explain why your chest tightens when you pass a hardware store, or why the smell of motor oil in a parking garage makes you want to sit on the curb and breathe until the world steadies. We don't always cut people out with knives. Sometimes we do it with calendars. There were good days. Mornings when the light spilled through the blinds like a promise. I ran along the waterfront, counted the blue herons, felt the uncomplicated joy of a hot shower after sweat. Work went well. I pitched a slogan for a local bakery that the client loved. A friend taught me how to make a proper omelet. I bought a second-hand bookshelf and finally unpacked the last of the boxes from college. Progress adds up in little ways, the way rust does. You look back and think, I'm a different person now, and maybe you are. But a life is not only what you build, it's also what you've refused to repair. Sometimes I drafted texts to Dad and never sent them. Hey, how's the truck? Did you ever fix that leaky roof? I miss Mom today. The cursor blinked, patient as a held breath. I would picture him in that small house off Highway 99, watching a game with the volume too low, rubbing his thumb across a stain on the coffee table he never could sand out. I would picture him opening a door to an empty room and standing there longer than necessary, as if rooms could answer back. Then I would imagine the first words between us and panic at the weight of them. Words can feel like moving furniture after years of dust. Everything is heavier than it looks. When shame walks with you, it learns your routes. It knows which bridges you cross, and where you pause to read the posters for bands you'll never see. It knows the stories you tell about yourself, and it nods along, satisfied that you're staying small. Mine liked to remind me I was the kind of daughter who introduced her father as retired because mechanic sounded poor, sounded unambitious, sounded like a life you leave rather than a life you honor. And it liked to remind me that I was also the kind of daughter who learned to wear nice sweaters and correct verbs and thought that made her better. If this sounds hard on me, good. I want to be fair. I want to tell you that I did not arrive at forgiveness by pretending I had been a perfect victim of someone else's failing. You can't heal by leaving your own reflection out of the frame. There's a photo from when I was 5 that I carry in a drawer. In it, I'm on my father's shoulders at a county fair. My hair is a mess and my hands are sticky. Behind us is a Ferris wheel, a little blurry, as if joy itself refused to hold still. Dad's face is turned up, not toward the camera but toward me, and he's laughing. I didn't look at that picture for years. It didn't fit the story I preferred. But on certain evenings, when the city pressed in and I felt like an actor in someone else's play, I would take it out and sit with it. There was a time I had been small and happy above the world because his hands were sure. There was a time he had been enough. One Saturday last fall, I walked to the farmers' market on PSU's campus. The clouds had that pale, indecisive look. They might rain, they might not. I sampled pear slices and bought a jar of honey from a woman who told me her bees were unusually gentle this year. I found myself at a table of old tools someone had polished for resale, planes, clamps, chisels. I reached out and closed my fingers around a wrench with a nick in the handle. The metal was cool and stubborn. I tried to imagine my father in every tool, the way he held them, the patience of turning and turning until the stuck bolt finally yielded. Maybe the secret to who you are lies in the things you touch every day and the way you touch them. A man next to me said, "You know what you're looking for." He had a beard, a knitted cap, kind eyes. "Not really," I said, and set the wrench down as if it had burned me. "Just looking." "You look like you're trying to remember something," he said. "Maybe I am." That afternoon, I opened my phone and scrolled to the last voicemail my father had left. It was from months ago. "Hey, Liv," he said, his voice a little breathless as if he'd been walking. He doesn't call me Liv unless he's trying to be careful. "I fixed that old radio of your mom's. The one in the garage, thought you might want it. Plays a little static at first, but then it's clear. Anyway, call me if you want. No rush." The message ended, and a beat later, he hung up. He hadn't said, "Love you." He rarely did. But I had an image of him testing each station, tuning past the noise until something came through. Sometimes love is exactly that. Not words, not performance, but stubborn, patient tuning. You may be waiting for the blow to fall, the dramatic thing that shakes all this reasoning loose. This isn't that chapter. This is the chapter where I looked at my life and saw all the small doors I had closed, one by one, and the hallway they made. This is the chapter where the hallway grew so long and narrow that I could barely breathe. Sometimes the crisis is just claustrophobia, a life that doesn't have enough room for the truth anymore. Here's a small truth I can start with. My father never learned how to talk about feelings, but he never let go of me when I reached for his hand as a child crossing a parking lot. He would hold my wrist with a grip that said the world could wait. That memory is not the whole, but it is a piece. If you're stuck, maybe you can begin with a piece. Maybe you can let one good thing be true even if it doesn't excuse the rest. That night I sat on the floor by my window, the fern casting a little shadow against the sill. The city hummed. Somewhere far off, a siren rose and fell. I pulled out a blank card and a pen. I wasn't ready for a call. My voice would crack. I was afraid of the first silence after hello. But a card, paper could hold what I couldn't say out loud yet. I wrote, "Dad, I heard your message about Mom's radio. If it's still around, I'd like to have it. I'm sorry I've been distant. I don't have the right words yet, but I wanted to start here. Can we meet for coffee next month, maybe halfway?" I stared at the lines until they blurred. I didn't write love. I didn't write anything brave. I addressed the envelope to the house with the peeling paint, the one I could find in my sleep. Then I hesitated. You don't just admit to yourself you've been wrong and expect the earth to roll out a red carpet. The worthiest changes in our lives often begin with a tremor, not a trumpet. I set the card on the counter by my keys. I told myself I'd mail it in the morning. I didn't. Not then. I wish I had because it would make for a cleaner story. Look at me, undertaking the noble project of reconciliation on a calm, ordinary day. But I let it sit. Another week went by. Work got busy. An old friend came through town. Rain did what rain does here. Life kept me entertained enough to postpone the difficult good. Before you judge too harshly, either me or yourself, remember that delay is part of the human condition. We stall. We intellectualize. We wait for a sign. Maybe you're waiting right now. Maybe there's a name in your phone that glows every time you scroll past, and you hear their voice like a radio not quite tuned. You keep telling yourself you'll call when the noise in your head quiets down. You keep telling yourself there will be a perfect time. We both know there isn't. On the Friday that ends this chapter, I set my alarm early. I plan to run the loop by the river before work, to shake off the sleep and earn a muffin. I left the card on the counter. It watched me leave. The sky had that pearly Portland gray that makes every color look thoughtful. I tied my laces, adjusted my headphones, stepped off the curb. A bus pulled away from the stop, sighing. A cyclist zipped past. I thought about honey and gentle bees and the old wrench with the nick in it. I thought about how maybe the world is full of small dents that teach us how to hold on better. I didn't know then that a phone call would soon blow a hole through my careful postponements. I didn't know that when it came, the first person to cross the distance I had built would be the one man I had spent years pretending I didn't need. I didn't know, but I was finally, quietly, almost ready to listen. And if you're holding your breath, wondering when your moment will arrive, I'll ask you a simple question I've had to ask myself. Are you sure you're living right? If the story you tell about your family is the only one where you don't have to be brave, stay with me. The next steps are the ones that change everything. Resentment doesn't arrive with a crash. It seeps in slowly, like water dripping through the ceiling, unnoticed until the plaster buckles and the floor beneath you begins to sag. I used to think I hated my father for obvious reasons, but the truth is, it wasn't hatred at first. It was smaller, pettier, and more dangerous. The quiet accumulation of unmet expectations, the tiny disappointments that calcify into a story you start to tell yourself until it hardens into fact. When I was a child, there were moments that could have gone either way, moments when a few words from him might have changed the shape of my heart. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with my homework spread out before me, the pencils worn to nubs, my head tilted toward the doorway, waiting for him to come home. The door would creak open, his boots thudding against the floor, his shirt darkened with grease, the smell of gasoline clinging to him like a second skin. I would straighten in my chair, hoping he might notice me, maybe ask how my day was. Instead, he would grunt something under his breath, shuffle past me, and sink into the armchair in front of the television. The chair always seemed to swallow him whole, as if that was where he truly lived, not with us at the table, but in the flickering blue glow of the screen. To a little girl, silence feels like abandonment. And when silence repeats often enough, you begin to believe you're not worth speaking to. My mother tried to explain it away. She would ruffle my hair, kiss my temple, and say, "That's just who he is, Liv. He loves you, he just doesn't know how to show it." But when you're 10 years old, you don't want invisible love. You want visible proof. Words, smiles, laughter. The same gestures you see other fathers give their children. When love doesn't look the way you expect, it feels absent, and absence breeds anger. I carried that anger to school without meaning to. At parent-teacher nights, other fathers arrived in crisp shirts and polished shoes, shaking hands, asking questions about grades, smiling proudly as they looked over their children's projects. My father came in worn boots, his hair flattened by a cap he had forgotten to remove until the last minute, his hands still bearing the smudges of a long day's work. He stood awkwardly in the corner, nodding at whatever the teacher said, and I sat at my desk wishing I could sink into the floorboards. When my friends boasted about weekend trips or new bikes, I swallowed the envy and went silent. The only gifts my father ever gave were practical things: a heavy coat, a flashlight, a set of tools. "You'll need this someday," he would say, as if preparing me for a life where comfort was always earned, never given. But at 15, practicality felt like a punishment. I didn't want what I needed. I wanted something frivolous, unnecessary, something that proved he saw me not as another responsibility to maintain, but as a daughter to be cherished. The resentment grew in layers, one for every birthday where the cake was small and the gift utilitarian, one for every school performance where the chair meant for him stayed empty, one for every silence that stretched too long across the dinner table. By the time I was old enough to understand my friends' easy pride when they spoke about their fathers, I had already decided mine wasn't worth mentioning. I avoided saying his name. When people asked what he did, I muttered something vague and changed the subject. It wasn't just embarrassment, it was a belief, growing stronger each year, that he had failed me in ways too deep to repair. And then my mother died. She had been the bridge between us, the translator who made his gruffness tolerable, who softened his rough edges with her laughter and her endless patience. When she was there, I could almost believe his silence was harmless, that his love was hiding somewhere behind the walls he built around himself. But when she was gone, the walls closed in. I remember the night of her funeral, the house unnaturally quiet, the scent of lilies and candle wax still heavy in the air. I sat in her armchair clutching one of her scarves, waiting for him to come sit beside me, to put his arm around me, to tell me we would survive this together. Instead, he busied himself in the kitchen, washing dishes with a single-minded focus, scrubbing so hard I thought the plates might break in his hands. When the counters gleamed, he dried his hands, mumbled good night, and went to bed. I sat alone in the silence, fury rising in me, convinced that his refusal to grieve with me meant he had never really loved her or me. That night, something inside me snapped. The gap between us became a canyon. If he couldn't show up in the one moment when we both needed each other most, I told myself, then he never would. Grief demands an outlet, and I gave mine a target. I blamed him for everything, for her illness, for her absence, for the years of silence that had led us here. In the irrational mathematics of mourning, his failures added up neatly, and blame was easier to carry than loss. By the time I went to college, the decision was made. I didn't need him. I didn't want him. I packed my boxes without asking for his help. He carried them anyway, one by one, setting them carefully in the trunk of the car. He drove me to campus, filling the silence with small talk about gas prices and traffic. When we arrived, he hugged me briefly, too briefly, and said, "Take care." 2 words to cover 18 years. I walked away without looking back, telling myself this was freedom. In truth, it was surrender, a handing over of whatever fragile bond we had left. Distance became my shield. At school, when friends called their fathers for advice, I stayed quiet. When they went home for the holidays, I made excuses to stay behind. When asked about my parents, I said, "It's just me now." It wasn't the truth, but it was easier. Truth would have meant explaining why I couldn't bear to hear his voice, why the sound of his silence on the other end of the line was worse than no call at all. So I let him fade. Each unanswered voicemail, each unopened letter, each unreturned gesture was another brick in the wall I built to keep him out. But resentment doesn't just keep someone else out, it keeps you in. The more I told myself he didn't care, the more I searched for proof. If he forgot a holiday, it was negligence. If his message was short, it was indifference. Even when he sent money to cover expenses I hadn't told him about, I convinced myself it was guilt, not love. Every action he took was twisted by the lens I had chosen, and the lens was fixed firmly in place. I was determined to see him as absent, even when he was trying in his clumsy, halting way to be present. There was a winter concert my sophomore year that sealed the narrative for me. I had a solo, my first. I circled the date on the calendar, left a note on the kitchen table, even reminded him the night before. 7 o'clock tomorrow, Dad. Don't be late. He nodded without looking up. The night of the concert, the auditorium was filled with proud parents holding bouquets, cameras flashing, laughter echoing in the halls. I walked onto the stage, lights blinding, voice trembling, and then steadying as the music carried me. When it ended, the applause was thunderous. I scanned the crowd, heart pounding, desperate to find his face. Row after row, but he wasn't there. I walked home alone, the cold air biting, the silence louder than applause. He came in past midnight, smelling of oil and fatigue, and asked casually, "Concert good?" I wanted to scream. Instead, I said, "Yeah, fine." Then I went to my room and something inside me closed for good. By the time I was 20, I had decided I didn't have a father. Not really. Just a man who lived in the same house until I was old enough to leave, a man who knew how to fix engines but not hearts. I carried that decision into adulthood, wore it like armor, repeated it until it sounded like truth. I told myself I was free of him, that I didn't need him. But freedom built on denial is a cage of its own making, and the bars only tighten the longer you pretend they are not there. College was supposed to be the great escape. I chose a school farther from home than necessary, convincing myself the distance would give me clarity, or at least relief. When my new friends spoke fondly of their fathers, I stayed silent or offered vague answers. "It's just me now," I would say, and no one pressed further. It was easier that way, easier to live as though he didn't exist, easier to imagine myself as independent, self-made. But independence, when built on erasure, always comes with an echo. The echo followed me everywhere. In the dorm lounge when a friend called her dad to ask how to fix a leaky faucet. In the dining hall when another boasted about her father driving 4 hours just to deliver homemade soup. At night, when roommates scrolled through cheerful text threads from their families, I scrolled past my father's number in silence. Each time I told myself I was fine without him, resentment tightened its grip. And yet, he never really disappeared. He had his ways of reaching through the walls I had built. A check arrived in the mail one winter, unsigned but written in the familiar slanted script I had seen on grocery lists and notes stuck to the fridge. It covered more than a month of my rent. Once I came home to find a package waiting for me, a heavy coat, perfectly my size, though I had never told him I needed one. A voicemail once crackled through. "Hey, Liv, truck's still running. Hope classes are good. Call if you need anything." His words were clumsy, ordinary. I deleted the message without replying, telling myself it didn't matter. But for nights afterward, his voice played on repeat in my head, like a song I didn't want to admit I loved. Resentment is strange like that. It can't bear to admit weakness. It twists kindness into guilt, love into obligation. If he sent money, it was only because he felt bad. If he called, it was because he was lonely, not because he wanted me. If he gave me a gift, it was just another attempt to ease his conscience. That was the story I told myself, and the story was easier than the possibility that I was wrong. During one spring break, I returned home for a few days, not because I missed him, but because a friend offered me a ride and I had nowhere else to go. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The paint peeled, the lawn was unkempt, the air inside still held that faint tang of oil even in the kitchen. He was in the garage, bent over the hood of an old Chevy, his hands steady, his face creased with years of sun and grease. When he saw me, his expression flickered between surprise and something softer. "Didn't think you were coming," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, waiting for something, anything, that looked like joy. He nodded toward the fridge. "Got your favorite root beer in there." I hadn't touched root beer in years, but I opened the fridge, took a bottle, and sipped it anyway. The bubbles stung my throat. I told myself it was proof he didn't know me anymore. Now, years later, I see it for what it was. His way of saying, "I remember." But resentment doesn't allow for reinterpretation in the moment. At 21, I wanted a conversation, a confession, a connection. Instead, I got carbonation in a bottle. That night, I packed my bag early. He offered to drive me back, but I refused, saying I would catch the bus. As I rolled my suitcase out the door, I glanced back once. He was standing in the driveway, hands deep in his jacket pockets, shoulders hunched against the wind. He looked smaller than I remembered. I didn't wave. Resentment had already written the ending for me. I was better off leaving him behind. The years that followed were filled with moments that could have been bridges but became walls. When I graduated college, he called a week before the ceremony. "Liv," he said, "I can make it up there if you want me to. I'll close the shop, drive up the night before. Might have to sleep in the truck, but I'll be there." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. I stood in my dorm room, staring at the chipped paint on the desk, torn between the longing I buried and the pride I clung to. Part of me wanted him there, wanted to see his face in the crowd. But another part, harder, louder, insisted he hadn't earned it. Where was he at the winter concert? At prom? At the funeral? Why should he get to stand in the sunlight of my success when he hadn't been there in the shadows? So I told him no. "It's fine, Dad. I've got friends coming. Tickets are limited." There was a pause, and then he said softly, "All right, just thought I'd ask." I hung up quickly. On graduation day, I walked across the stage, smiling for the cameras, hearing the cheers. But when I looked into the sea of faces, there was an emptiness that no applause could fill. I posed with friends afterward, my smile wide, my diploma clutched in my hands. But later, looking at the photos, my eyes found the empty space where he should have been. Pride had stolen something from me that day, though I couldn't admit it then. After college, I moved to Portland and began my job at the agency. The city gave me new routines, new people, new distractions. I told myself I was finally free, finally building a life on my own terms. But resentment doesn't disappear just because you change your address. It lingers, echoing in unexpected moments. Like when my car broke down on the freeway and I sat in the dark, waiting for a tow truck, remembering how easily his hands had fixed things. Or when I struggled to move furniture into my new apartment and thought, if Dad were here, this would be done already. Or when I walked past a father teaching his daughter to ride a bike, his hand steady on the back of the seat, and felt a sudden ache in my chest. I ignored those whispers. I buried them beneath work deadlines and weekend outings. But they grew louder, no matter how hard I tried to silence them. Pride kept me from picking up the phone. Fear kept me from admitting what I really wanted. And so I stayed locked in the story I had written, that my father was a man who never cared and that I was stronger without him. But stories, even the false ones, carry consequences. They shape the choices we make, the doors we close, the lives we live half-empty. I lived in that half-life for years, convincing myself it was whole. Until the night when everything shattered, and the man I thought I didn't need became the first person I saw when I opened my eyes. The story I told myself became such a part of me that I stopped noticing how much it cost. It was like carrying a heavy backpack everywhere. At first you're aware of the weight, but eventually it just feels like your posture, like the natural way you move through the world. My posture became one of distance, of shrugging off any mention of him, of smiling quickly when people spoke about their families, so the conversation could move on before anyone noticed the gap in mine. Yet no matter how much distance I built, reminders of him slipped in through the cracks. I would see a man on the bus with oil-stained hands and feel a pang I didn't want to name. I would pass a garage on my walk to work, the air thick with gasoline and burnt rubber, and the smell would drag me back to childhood afternoons when I sat on a stool in his shop, swinging my legs, waiting for him to look up from the engine and notice me. He rarely did, and even then his words were curt. "Hand me that wrench," or "Don't touch that." But there was something steady about those hours, the hum of machines, the rhythm of his breath as he worked. I used to crave that steadiness. Later, I convinced myself it was emptiness. The truth was probably somewhere in between, but resentment doesn't deal in nuance. It deals in absolutes. There was one night, a couple of years after graduation, when my resolve cracked, even if only for an evening. I had just broken off a relationship that had lasted longer than it should have. The apartment felt cavernous in its silence. I poured myself a glass of wine, sat on the floor by the window, and stared at my phone. His number was still there, though I had scrolled past it countless times. My thumb hovered over the call button. I imagined the way he would answer, gruff, cautious, maybe surprised. I imagined stumbling through an apology, or at least an attempt at conversation. For a moment, I even let myself picture driving down to see him, walking through the garage door, sitting across from him at the kitchen table where so many silences had sat before. But then pride surged, the familiar armor snapping back into place. What if he didn't answer? What if he did and said nothing worth hearing? What if all I heard was more silence, the same silence that had scarred me as a child? I locked the phone and shoved it under a pillow as if hiding it could erase the longing. Pride, I told myself, is safer than disappointment. Safer, maybe, but not lighter. I went to bed that night with the same heavy backpack, straps digging deeper into my shoulders. Work became my excuse for everything. Advertising has a way of consuming you. Deadlines, clients, pitches, revisions. I let it swallow me whole. If anyone asked about my family, I waved them off with the same lines. It's just me now. We're not close. I became so skilled at telling the story that even I began to believe it. But there were nights when the lie collapsed, and I would sit in the dark with tears I couldn't explain. Because the truth is, absence doesn't stop mattering just because you've declared it irrelevant. If anything, pretending it doesn't matter makes it hurt more. I remember one holiday in particular. Christmas in Portland has its own kind of gray beauty, the air cold and damp, lights strung across porches glowing against the fog. My friends scattered home to their families, and I stayed behind, telling them I preferred the quiet. On Christmas morning, I walked to the corner cafe, the only place open, and ordered black coffee, and a croissant that flaked into crumbs on the table. Around me, families gathered, children in bright scarves, parents leaning close, laughter spilling into the air. I stared at my phone again. There was a voicemail waiting from 2 days earlier. His voice was rough but careful. "Hey, Liv, not sure if you're home this week. Just wanted to say Merry Christmas. Got the lights up on the house. Looks kind of silly without the big tree your mom used to put up. Anyway, hope you're warm. Talk soon." I deleted it before it finished playing. My heart hammered as if I had done something shameful. Later, alone in my apartment with only the sound of the radiator clicking, I realized that shame wasn't because of what he said. It was because I wanted to hear it again. I wanted to press play, to let his voice fill the room, even if just for a minute. But my pride had cut it off, the same way it had cut off so many other chances. Resentment works like rust. It spreads slowly, quietly, eating away at the structure until one day something collapses under the weight. For me, that collapse came in smaller ways before the larger break. A friend's father died suddenly, and I sat at the funeral watching her sob in the pew, surrounded by siblings and cousins, telling story after story of the man who had shaped their lives. I cried too, but not just for her. I cried because I knew that if the same thing happened to me, I wouldn't have stories to tell, not because they weren't there, but because I had buried them so deep under anger I couldn't reach them anymore. There were stories worth remembering. The day he taught me how to ride a bike, running alongside me until his breath came in short bursts, then letting go without telling me, so that when I realized I was pedaling alone, the pride felt like flight. The nights he stayed up fixing the heater so the house would be warm in the morning. The way he once carried me through a flooded street after a storm, water rising around his knees, his arms locked tight around me. But I had thrown those memories into a box labeled "not enough" and shoved it to the back of my mind. It was easier to hold on to the hurts, the disappointments, the missed moments. Easier to believe the story where he failed me completely, rather than the more complicated truth where he loved me imperfectly. I clung to that simplified story like a lifeline. It gave me clarity, even if it was false. It gave me direction, even if it was away from him. I didn't see then that clarity built on half-truths eventually blurs. That direction built on avoidance eventually circles back. There's one more moment that belongs in this chapter, because it marked the point where my resentment was at its fiercest. I was 26, A year before the accident, working late on a project that left me drained and brittle. The phone rang. It was him. I stared at the screen, debating. Against my better judgment, I answered. His voice came through, tentative. "Hey, Liv, just wanted to check in, haven't heard from you in a while. Truck finally gave out, had to replace the transmission. Anyway, thought maybe we could grab dinner sometime if you're free." I froze. Every part of me wanted to say yes to agree to see him again, but the old script took over. "I'm busy," I said flatly. "Work's crazy, don't really have time." There was a pause on his end and then a quiet, "Sure, I understand." I hung up quickly, my hands trembling. And then, to my shame, I cried. Not because of what he said, but because I knew I had just slammed shut a door that might not open again. That night, lying awake in the dark, I admitted to myself something I had never said out loud. I was terrified. Terrified that if I let him back in, I would only be hurt again. Terrified that if I gave him another chance, he would waste it like before. But even more terrifying was the possibility that he wouldn't, that he might actually show up, might actually prove me wrong, and then I would have to face all the years I had wasted keeping him out. And so I chose the safer option. I chose silence. I chose pride. I chose to carry that heavy backpack a little longer, even as it bent me lower with every passing year. I couldn't know then that life was about to strip me of my choice. That one night, on a stretch of road I thought I knew by heart, everything would change. I couldn't know that the man I had spent so long resenting, the man I had sworn I didn't need, would be the first face I saw when I needed someone most. But that is the cruelty and the grace of life. It interrupts our stories. It breaks through the walls we build. It reminds us in the harshest ways of the truths we've tried to bury. And for me, that reminder came not in the safety of conversation, but in the chaos of an accident that shattered everything I thought I knew. The night of the accident began like any other. I had stayed late at the office, hunched over slides for a client presentation, the glow of the screen turning my skin sallow. Outside, Portland streets glistened with a fine mist that never quite decided to be rain. By the time I packed my bag and walked to the garage, it was nearly 9. The city was quiet in that in-between way, bars not yet full, shops shuttered, traffic thin but restless. I remember thinking I should have called a cab, but habit drew me to my car. Independence was still my armor, even when it was heavy. The highway was nearly empty, the lanes wide and dark, reflecting occasional bursts of light from passing trucks. I rolled down the window for air, the cold biting at my face, music low on the stereo. My mind was elsewhere, not on the road but on the email I hadn't answered, the pitch I still needed to rehearse, the loneliness waiting for me in my apartment. Maybe that's why I didn't notice the slick sheen until it was too late. The car in front of me braked suddenly, swerving to avoid debris scattered across the lane, a fallen box, maybe, or a tire tread. I hit the brakes, felt the wheels lock, the car skidding. Time stretched thin, snapping frame by frame. The steering wheel jerked in my hands, the guardrail rushed up, the screech of metal against metal ripping the night apart. There was a moment of weightlessness, a terrible stillness, and then the world folded in on itself. I don't remember the exact moment of impact. I remember sound, shattering glass, a crunch like bones breaking, my own scream swallowed by the violence of it all. I remember the taste of iron in my mouth, the sharp sting of something slicing across my forehead. Then nothing but silence. When I opened my eyes, everything was tilted. The airbag sagged against my chest, deflated, smelling of chemicals and smoke. The windshield was fractured into a spider web, raindrops clinging to the cracks like tiny prisms. My hands shook as I tried to move, but pain shot up my side, sharp and hot. My leg was pinned awkwardly, the seatbelt tight across my ribs. I gasped, realizing that breathing itself hurt. Somewhere in the distance, a horn blared, long and mournful, then cut off abruptly. The first thought that flashed through me wasn't fear of dying. It was loneliness. I thought, no one will know I'm here. No one will come. The irony stung. I had spent years insisting I didn't need anyone, and now all I wanted was someone to appear. My phone had been thrown somewhere in the crash. I couldn't reach it. The darkness pressed in, and for the first time in years I prayed. Not with words, not with formality, just a desperate plea to not be alone. Sirens came eventually. Red and blue lights painted the night, voices shouting, footsteps rushing. Hands reached in through the broken window, voices telling me to stay calm, that help was here. I drifted in and out, the cold seeping into my bones. They pried the door open, pulled me free, strapped me onto a stretcher. The sky wheeled above me, dizzy and indifferent. I caught fragments, possible concussion, fractured femur, internal bleeding. The ambulance doors slammed, the siren wailed, and I let go again. When I woke, it was to the sterile hum of machines and the antiseptic smell of a hospital room. The lights were too bright, the sheets too white. Pain anchored me, sharp and insistent. My throat was dry, my body heavy. I blinked, disoriented, and then I saw him. My father was there. He was sitting in a chair beside the bed, his shoulders hunched forward, his hands clasped tightly as if in prayer. His hair was grayer than I remembered, his jacket worn thin. His eyes, when they lifted to meet mine, were red-rimmed and exhausted, as if he hadn't slept in days. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. For years, I had erased him from my life, convinced myself he wasn't necessary. Yet here he was, solid and undeniable, the first face I saw when the world returned. "You're awake," he said softly. His voice cracked, the words fragile. He reached for my hand, hesitated, then took it gently as if afraid I might break further. His palm was rough, calloused, warm against my cold skin. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. Tears welled in my eyes, unexpected and hot. He squeezed my hand, his grip trembling. "You're gonna be all right, Liv. I'm here." Those 3 words, "I'm here," were heavier than anything I'd heard in years. They broke through layers of resentment, cracked the armor I had worn for so long. I wanted to ask how he had found me, why he had come, but I couldn't. The questions dissolved in the wave of emotion that crashed over me. For the first time in so long, I let myself rest in the presence of my father. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of painkillers and procedures. Surgeons mended the fractures, nurses adjusted Roman IV lines, doctors explained recovery plans. But through it all, he stayed. He slept in that chair, his jacket balled into a pillow, his body stiff from the awkward position. When I woke in the night, disoriented and afraid, he was always there, his eyes opening instantly as if attuned to my breathing. When I drifted back to sleep, I could hear the faint rustle of him shifting, the quiet rhythm of his presence filling the sterile space. I wanted to be angry, to ask why now, after all these years of absence. But lying in that bed, weak and broken, anger felt too heavy to carry. All I felt was gratitude and confusion. Gratitude that he had come. Confusion about why he had never been there before. My mind wrestled with both truths, even as my body fought to heal. One afternoon, as the rain tapped against the window and the city blurred beyond, I asked the question that had lodged in my throat since the moment I saw him. My voice was thin, cracked. "Why are you here?" He looked at me as though the question itself was foreign. "Because you're my daughter," he said simply. His tone carried no hesitation, no question, just fact. Where else would I be? Tears slid down my cheeks before I could stop them. I turned my face away, ashamed of how much his words undid me. For years I had told myself he didn't care, and now he was telling me he couldn't imagine being anywhere else. The contradiction tore me open. I didn't know how to hold both truths, the years of distance and this sudden, undeniable devotion. He didn't push me to respond. He didn't demand forgiveness. He just sat there, steady, silent, his presence louder than any words. And in that silence, something inside me shifted. The hospital days blurred together, each one marked not by the ticking of clocks, but by the rhythms of care. Nurses taking vitals, doctors adjusting medications, the faint beep of monitors reminding me I was still here. Time lost its sharp edges. Sometimes I woke in the middle of the night convinced it was morning, only to find the world still wrapped in darkness. Other times I drifted into uneasy dreams where the crash repeated itself in endless loops, the screech of tires and the sudden silence jolting me awake in sweat. And always when my eyes opened, he was there. My father. The man I had spent years resenting, years erasing. He sat vigil beside me as if he had never left, as if the canyon I had dug between us had been a mirage. He didn't hover or fuss, not in the way some parents might. He was quiet, present, steadfast. He brought me water when my throat ached, adjusted the blanket when I shivered, pressed the call button when the pain in my leg flared too high. He spoke little, but when he did, it was always gentle, like handling something fragile. "How's the pain today? Want me to dim the lights? Try to sleep, kiddo, I've got you." That word, kiddo, unlocked something buried deep. He hadn't called me that since middle school, back when I still believed his rough hands were strong enough to carry me through anything. I pretended not to hear it at first, but the sound of it clung to me, familiar and startling at once. It reminded me of nights when he carried me from the couch to bed after I'd fallen asleep watching TV, the scent of motor oil faint in his jacket, his arms solid and safe. I had forgotten those nights, or maybe I had chosen to forget them, burying them under years of bitterness. But the word brought them back, uninvited, undeniable. There were moments I tried to resist his presence. I told him he didn't need to stay, that the hospital staff could handle everything, that he should go home and rest. He shook his head, his jaw set in the same stubborn line I remembered from my childhood. "Not leaving," he said. "Not while you're here." There was no argument in his tone, no room for negotiation. He said it the way he fixed engines, simply, decisively, without flourish. I wanted to be angry, but the anger fizzled in the face of his quiet certainty. Instead, I turned away and cried softly into the pillow, frustrated by how much I needed him. Visitors came and went. Friends from work brought flowers and awkward smiles, promising to cover my tasks until I returned. A neighbor from my building dropped off a bag of books and magazines. They all stayed for a few minutes, offered hugs, and left with reassurances that I would be fine. But he stayed. Day after day, night after night, through the monotony and the fear. I began to realize that presence, more than words, was his true language. He had always spoken it, I had simply refused to learn it. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult round of physical therapy, I broke down. The pain was sharp, and the humiliation sharper. I had always prided myself on independence, on moving through the world without leaning on anyone. Now I could barely take 3 steps with a walker. I sank back into the bed, tears burning my eyes, muttering, "I can't do this." My voice was raw, defeated. He leaned forward, his eyes steady, his voice low. "Yes, you can. You've done harder things." I shook my head, sobbing. "Not like this, not broken." He reached for my hand, his thumb rough against my skin, and said quietly, "You're not broken, you're hurt. Hurt heals. Broken means gone, and you're not gone, you're right here." Those words sank deep, deeper than I wanted to admit. For years I had believed I was broken by his absence, that something in me had been permanently damaged. But in that moment, I realized he had never seen me as broken, just hurt, just someone who could heal. The simplicity of his faith cracked something open in me. I squeezed his hand back, not trusting myself to speak. As the days stretched into weeks, I started to notice the toll it was taking on him. His clothes were wrinkled, his eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. He ate little, surviving on cafeteria sandwiches and vending machine coffee. Once, in the early morning hours when he thought I was asleep, I saw him rub his temples, his shoulders slumping, his face etched with exhaustion. He wasn't young anymore, and the strain was visible. But when he noticed my eyes open, he straightened immediately, offering a smile as if to reassure me. "Morning, kiddo," he said softly. My chest ached with guilt. I had pushed him away for so long, and now he was giving everything without question. I began to ask him small things, tentative bridges across the canyon. "Could you bring me some tea instead of coffee? Can you read me what the doctor wrote down? Tell me what the weather's like outside." Each time he responded eagerly, grateful for the chance to do something, anything. And each time I felt the resentment loosen its grip, replaced by something unfamiliar, acceptance, maybe even love. One night, unable to sleep, I asked him about the garage. His face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. He talked about an old truck he'd been restoring, about the satisfaction of hearing an engine purr after hours of stubborn silence. His words tumbled out, animated and passionate, his hands gesturing as if holding invisible tools. I watched him, really watched him, and realized this was who he had always been. A man who poured his love into fixing things, even when those things weren't machines. Maybe he had tried to fix me too in his way, with coats and flashlights and checks in the mail. I had dismissed them, but maybe they were his language of care all along. When he finished, he looked embarrassed, as if he had said too much. "Sorry," he muttered. "Didn't mean to ramble." I shook my head, my throat tight. "No, I liked it." He blinked, surprised, then smiled faintly. It was the kind of smile that carried years of weight, a mixture of relief and sorrow. The accident had stripped me bare, left me vulnerable in ways I couldn't hide. But in that vulnerability, I began to see him differently. Not as the father I had wanted, not as the father I had resented, but as the man he truly was, flawed, quiet, stubborn, and steady. The man who had failed in words but never in presence. The man who, despite everything, had come running when I needed him most. Recovery is not measured in days or weeks, but in inches. An inch of progress, an inch of healing, an inch of courage to take one more step. The accident had broken more than bones. It had fractured the story I'd been telling myself for years. And so, as my body stitched itself back together with screws and scars, I found myself piecing together the truth of who my father had always been. The hospital released me into a world that no longer felt familiar. My apartment, once a refuge of independence, now looked like an obstacle course. The steps up to my door seemed steeper, the hallway narrower, the bathroom too small for the walker that scraped against the walls. Friends offered to help, but they had their own lives, their own jobs, their own routines. I smiled politely, thanked them, and assured them I could manage. But the truth was I couldn't. I needed him, and he came. He carried my bags inside, stacked groceries in the kitchen, rearranged furniture so I could move without tripping. He fixed the loose railing on the stairs, tightened the screws on the wobbly chair, patched the crack in the wall I had ignored for months. He moved through my apartment like a man on a mission, and for the first time, I realized he was building a space where I could heal. It was the same thing he had done my whole life, repairing, steadying, fixing, but I had never seen it for what it was. Now, with my body fragile and my pride cracked open, I saw clearly. His devotion wasn't in words but in labor, in the quiet certainty of hands that refused to rest until things were right. At night, he slept on the couch, though I knew the springs dug into his back. I told him he could go home, that I would be fine. He shook his head just as he had in the hospital. "Not leaving," he said simply. "Not until you're steady." That was his way, direct, stubborn, immovable. And I stopped arguing because a part of me, the part I had denied for years, was grateful. The days settled into a rhythm. Physical therapy in the mornings, exercises that made me sweat and grit my teeth. Pain was constant, but so was his presence. He drove me to every appointment, sitting in the waiting room with a thermos of coffee, reading an old paperback novel whose cover was frayed. Sometimes I caught him dozing, chin on his chest, but when the door opened and I limped out, his eyes snapped awake, searching for me. "How'd it go?" he would ask, and I would shrug. "Hard." He nodded as if that single word was enough, and maybe it was. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling session, I collapsed onto the couch, tears burning hot. "I can't do this," I whispered. "It's too much." He crouched beside me, his face lined with exhaustion, and placed a hand on my knee. "You can," he said firmly. "You've already done the hardest part. You're still here." The words struck me like a chord. I thought back to the crash, to the moment when I had believed no one would come. Yet here I was, alive, breathing, and here he was, steady as ever. The simplicity of his faith became my anchor. Slowly, stories began to slip out, not because he forced them, but because the silence between us softened. One evening, as we sat with the television humming in the background, I asked, "Why did you come that night? How did you even know?" He looked at me, puzzled, as though the question itself made no sense. "Because you're my daughter," he said. "When the hospital called, I didn't think, I just drove." His voice was even, but his eyes shone with something raw. "I almost lost your mother once. I wasn't about to lose you." I wanted to argue, to remind him of all the years he had been absent in the ways I needed. But the truth in his eyes silenced me. He had never stopped being my father, even when I had stopped being his daughter. As weeks passed, I began to notice the small details I had once overlooked. How he cooked simple meals, always making sure there was enough for leftovers the next day. How he repaired the loose hinge on the bathroom door without mentioning it. How he left a glass of water by my bed each night, as if anticipating my thirst. These were not grand gestures, not the cinematic declarations of love I had once craved. They were ordinary, almost invisible, and yet they were everything. One night, unable to sleep, I wandered into the living room where he sat reading. The lamp cast a circle of light on his face, highlighting the deep creases carved by years of labor. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I asked quietly. He looked up, confused. "Tell you what?" "All the things you did. The money you sent, the repairs," my voice cracked. "The ways you helped, even when I didn't want you." He closed the book slowly, setting it on the table. His hands rested on the worn cover, fingers splayed. "Didn't think I needed to tell you," he said. "Figured you'd know." His voice was gentle, almost apologetic. "Guess I was wrong." The weight of his words pressed down on me. For years, I had mistaken his silence for indifference, when really it had been assumption. His belief that actions were louder than words, that I could see love in the things he built, the bills he paid, the sacrifices he made. But I hadn't seen. I had been blind, demanding a language he didn't know how to speak, ignoring the one he offered freely. And in that realization, resentment began to dissolve. Recovery forced me to rely on him in ways I never had before. He helped me dress when the pain was too sharp, steadied me as I climbed the stairs, drove me through traffic when my reflexes weren't yet reliable. Each time, pride prickled, but gratitude softened it. I began to say thank you, quietly at first, then louder. He never replied with "you're welcome." He just nodded as if thanks were unnecessary, but I could see it mattered. His shoulders relaxed, his eyes warmed, and for once, silence felt full instead of empty. We had our first real conversation one rainy afternoon. The power had flickered out, leaving the apartment dim. We sat at the table, a candle between us. The sound of rain drummed on the roof. I asked him about Mom. His face softened, his gaze distant. "She was the light," he said. "She laughed at everything, even my bad jokes. She held us together." He paused, swallowing hard. "When she died, I didn't know how to fill that space. I tried, but I didn't know how." His voice cracked. "I thought keeping busy, keeping things running, would be enough, but I guess you needed more." Tears blurred my vision. For the first time, I understood he hadn't failed because he didn't care. He had failed because he didn't know how to be what I needed. And instead of telling him, I had walked away. The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't heavy. It was tender, like soil turned over, ready for something new to grow. I reached across the table, placed my hand on his. His skin was rough, warm, trembling slightly. "I see it now," I whispered. "I see what you did for me. I just didn't know how to see it before." His eyes filled with tears, but he blinked them back, squeezing my hand. "That's all I ever wanted," he said. "For you to know." The weeks bled into months, and with each passing day, the canyon narrowed. I began to laugh again, small bursts at first, then louder. He teased me gently when I grew impatient with therapy, and I teased him back about his snoring on the couch. We found a rhythm, one built not on resentment but on recognition. I saw him not as the father I had wished for, not as the father I had hated, but as the man who had always been there in his own quiet way. And for the first time, that was enough. By the time I could walk steadily without the cane, he began to talk about heading home. "You don't need me underfoot anymore," he said, half joking. Panic flared in me at the thought of him leaving. I realized then how much I had come to rely on his presence, how much the thought of an empty apartment unsettled me. "Stay a little longer," I said quickly. He looked at me, surprised, then nodded. "As long as you need." Relief washed over me, and for once I didn't hide it. One evening, as we sat on the balcony watching the sunset bleed into the city skyline, I turned to him and said, "I thought I had cut you out of my life. I thought I didn't need you." He nodded slowly, eyes on the horizon. "I know, but I was wrong," I whispered. "I always needed you, I just didn't know how to admit it." He turned then, his gaze steady, his voice quiet but firm. "Doesn't matter how long it takes, I'm here now, and I'll keep being here." Tears slipped down my cheeks, and I let them. For once, I didn't hide the softness, didn't armor myself with pride. I leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around me, holding me steady. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about devotion. Not the loud, dramatic kind that fills books and movies, but the silent devotion that builds a life brick by brick. A devotion that fixes what is broken, that shows up without question, that stays even when uninvited. My father's love had always been that kind of devotion. Silent, steady, invisible until I finally opened my eyes. And now, as I faced the long road ahead, I knew it would carry me the rest of the way. Healing is a strange kind of education. It teaches you what matters not by giving you new lessons, but by stripping away everything unnecessary until only the essential remains. By the time I was steady enough to walk without a cane, the essential was clear. My father and I had been circling each other for years, orbiting in silence, but now the distance had narrowed. We were no longer two separate worlds. We were beginning to build a bridge, plank by plank, awkward and slow, but real. I remember the first time I ventured outside alone after the accident. The air was cold, sharp, with the tang of pine and damp pavement. My legs wobbled with each step, my confidence fragile. But I walked down the block, turned the corner, and returned, triumphant in a way I hadn't felt since childhood. He was waiting at the window, watching like a sentry. When I came through the door, he grinned, wide and unguarded, and said, "Knew you could." Pride swelled in me, not just my own pride, but his, visible at last. For years I had begged silently for that look, that smile, that recognition. And here it was, freely given. We began to share meals not just as sustenance, but as conversations. He cooked in his simple way, scrambled eggs, grilled cheese, stew heavy with potatoes. I teased him for using too much salt, and he laughed, a rusty sound I realized I hadn't heard in years. Over dinner, I asked about his childhood, something I had never thought to do before. He told me about growing up poor in a small Oregon town, about dropping out of high school to help his father in the fields, about discovering engines when most boys were still discovering baseball. His stories were plain, but they carried the weight of survival, of choices made without luxury. Listening to him, I understood for the first time that his silence had been forged in necessity, not neglect. He had never been taught the language of tenderness, so he spoke the only way he knew, through work, through provision, through the reliability of his hands. The more he shared, the more I saw the man behind the myths I had built. I had painted him as absent, unfeeling, stubborn. But here was a man who had carried burdens I had never acknowledged, who had sacrificed pieces of himself so I could have more than he ever did. Shame pricked me, sharp and insistent, but alongside it grew something else, compassion. For the first time, I wanted to understand him, not just judge him. We fell into rituals. Every morning he'd read the newspaper while I did my stretches. He circled stories he thought I'd like, about community projects, about local art shows, and left them on the counter. In the afternoons, we walked slowly around the neighborhood, me leaning on him more than I admitted. He greeted neighbors by name, people I had never noticed before. They waved back warmly, some stopping to chat, asking how I was recovering. "Your dad's been keeping us updated," they'd say, smiling. It stunned me. Even in the years I had shut him out, he had been telling others about me, carrying my story when I refused to carry his. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of orange, I asked him a question that had haunted me since childhood. "Why didn't you come to my concert? The winter one, sophomore year." The words tumbled out before I could stop them, raw and accusing. He stopped walking, his brow furrowed, his mouth opening then closing. Finally, he said quietly, "I was there, Liv. I was standing in the back. Got there late after a shift ran long. I saw you sing. You were beautiful." His voice cracked. "By the time I found a seat, it was over. I didn't want to embarrass you, so I slipped out." The ground tilted beneath me. All these years, I had carried the memory as proof of his absence when in truth he had been there unseen. Tears blurred my vision as I whispered, "Why didn't you tell me?" He shrugged helplessly. "Didn't think it mattered. Thought you'd know." That refrain again, "thought you'd know." How many wounds had been carved by those words? How much pain could have been spared if either of us had spoken plainly? The bridge between us was fragile, but that night it grew stronger. I told him about the resentment, about the years I had convinced myself he didn't care. He listened without defense, his eyes steady, his jaw tight with sorrow. "I failed you," he said softly, "not because I didn't love you, because I didn't know how to show it." His honesty broke something open in me. I reached for his hand, squeezing it hard. "I failed too," I admitted, "because I didn't want to see the ways you did show it." We sat there in the fading light, two flawed people admitting our failures, and somehow that admission became the foundation of something new. The weeks turned into months, and the routines became comfort. He taught me how to fix a leaky faucet, how to check the oil in my car, how to hammer a nail without bending it. I had once dismissed these skills as trivial, but now I saw them as lessons, gifts passed down from hands that had worked harder than mine ever would. In return, I taught him how to use my laptop, how to send emails, how to video call. He fumbled with the keys, swore under his breath, then laughed at his own clumsiness. We were both learning, both stretching into new languages for each other. There were setbacks, too. Days when the pain in my leg flared so sharply I snapped at him. Days when pride made me reject his help even though I needed it. But he never pushed back with anger. He gave me space, then returned quietly, steady as always. It struck me then that love is not the absence of conflict, but the persistence of presence. And he persisted. The turning point came one evening when he handed me a small box. Inside was the old radio that had belonged to my mother, the one that had sat in the garage gathering dust. He had fixed it, painstakingly, soldering wires and replacing knobs until it hummed to life again. "Thought you might want this," he said. I turned the dial and music crackled through, filling the room with warmth. I remembered her then, singing softly in the kitchen, the radio on the windowsill, her voice weaving through the air. Tears spilled down my cheeks, but this time they were not only for loss, they were for connection. My father had brought her back to me in the only way he knew how. That night, I placed the radio on my nightstand and listened until I fell asleep, the static and melody mingling. In the morning, I found him at the table with a cup of coffee, his eyes tired but peaceful. "Thank you," I whispered. He nodded, and that was enough. Rebuilding bridges is not a single act. It is not one apology or one gesture. It is 1,000 small choices, made day after day, to see each other clearly and to stay even when it's hard. My father and I were making those choices, slowly, awkwardly, but faithfully. And as I watched him fix the loose hinge on my door, humming under his breath, I realized the truth. He had never stopped building. I had just finally stepped onto the bridge he had been constructing all along. In the quiet of that realization, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not just gratitude, not just relief, but love, steady, imperfect, silent, and strong. The kind of love that endures storms, survives mistakes, and waits patiently until you are ready to see it. And for the first time, I let myself see it. Recovery is rarely a straight line. It bends, dips, doubles back on itself. Some mornings I woke feeling strong, almost convinced I was whole again, only to stumble by noon and feel like I was starting over. But the difference now was that I no longer stumbled alone. He was there, steadying me not with lectures or grand speeches, but with the small constancy of his presence. And in those steady hours, bridges became stronger. It was during one of those uneven weeks, when my body felt ready but my spirit lagged, that I began to see him with new eyes. I had always thought of my father as unshakable, a figure who simply endured, who pressed forward without breaking. But as he sat at my table each night, drinking coffee too strong for my taste, I began to notice the fatigue in his posture, the way his hands trembled slightly when he thought I wasn't looking. I saw him wince as he bent to pick up something I dropped, the stiffness in his knees, the faint wheeze in his breath when he climbed the stairs. He was not unshakable. He was aging. And in his aging, I saw not weakness but evidence of years spent carrying more than his share. One evening, after another round of therapy left me exhausted, I asked him a question I had avoided for years. "Why did you never remarry?" He looked up from the paper, surprised, then set it down slowly. "Didn't want to," he said. His voice was calm, but his eyes wandered to the window, distant. "Your mom was it for me. After she was gone, I figured my job was just you." The simplicity of it stunned me. I had told myself countless stories about his silence after Mom's death, convinced he hadn't cared enough. But here was the truth. He had cared so much he couldn't imagine moving on. His love had been singular, unwavering, and he had poured the rest into me, even when I refused to see it. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about devotion. Not the kind that writes poems or sings songs, but the kind that works late shifts to pay tuition, that drives hours to sit in hospital rooms, that fixes radios and leaves root beer in the fridge because it remembers your childhood preferences. I realized I had mistaken his devotion for absence, simply because it didn't speak the language I wanted. But love doesn't always arrive dressed in words. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in persistence, in the shape of a man who never stops showing up even when you push him away. Our conversations grew easier, not fluent but flowing in a way they never had before. We talked about my work, about his garage, about Mom. He shared stories of her stubbornness, her humor, her way of softening him with a single glance. I laughed through tears as he described their first date at a county fair, where she beat him at a ring toss game and teased him for weeks afterward. For years I had carried grief like a locked box, refusing to open it. Now, sitting with him, I realized the stories were keys, and together we were unlocking a part of her that still lived in both of us. There were hard moments, too. Old wounds surfaced, sharp and sudden. One afternoon, I asked why he hadn't told me about the checks he'd sent during college, the quiet support I had only learned of recently. His jaw tightened. "Didn't think you'd want to hear from me," he admitted. "You made it clear you didn't." The words cut, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. I had slammed doors and he had accepted the closure, trying to love me from the shadows. We sat in silence, the weight of our failures heavy between us. Finally, I whispered, "I wish you had pushed harder." He looked at me, eyes filled with both regret and tenderness. "I didn't want to push you away more than I already had." The humility in his voice undid me. I reached for his hand, and for the first time I didn't let go quickly. As the weeks passed, I began to notice how others saw him. Neighbors greeted him warmly, store clerks smiled, mechanics at the local shop clapped him on the back. People knew him, respected him. One afternoon, as we left the grocery store, a man stopped us. "Daniel Harper," he said, grinning. "This man taught me everything I know about engines, saved my job, maybe even my marriage, because I kept it thanks to him." My father chuckled awkwardly, muttered something modest, and we walked on. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. All those years I had been ashamed of him, thinking his world was small, while in truth his influence had stretched further than I realized. He had been a mentor, a helper, a quiet force in the lives of others. I had measured his worth by the wrong scale, blind to the impact he left everywhere he went. That night, I asked him why he had never told me about all the people he had helped. He shrugged. Didn't seem important, just did what needed doing. His humility humbled me. I thought of all the ways I had chased recognition, grades, promotions, achievements, while he had built a legacy without ever naming it. His silence, once my greatest complaint, had been the soil where countless others had grown. The bridge between us strengthened with every shared truth. We began to cook together, me chopping vegetables slowly, him stirring pots with practiced ease. We teased each other about our methods, laughed at our mistakes. We took short drives on weekends, him at the wheel while I rolled down the window, the air cool and clean. We didn't need to fill every silence. Sometimes it was enough to just be, side by side, the presence itself a language we were finally both fluent in. Still, guilt lingered. One night, unable to sleep, I walked into the living room where he was dozing in the armchair. I sat on the couch across from him, the lamp casting soft shadows, and whispered, "I'm sorry." He stirred, opened his eyes slowly. "For what?" "For the years I pushed you away, for believing you didn't care, for cutting you out of my life when all you ever did was try." My voice trembled, tears blurred my vision. I wasted so much time. He looked at me for a long moment, then shook his head. "Time isn't wasted if we're here now." His words were simple, but they sank deep. I realized then that forgiveness is not about erasing the past, but about choosing the present. And in that present, we had found each other again. The accident had broken bones, but it had also broken illusions. It had shattered the walls I had built, forced me to see the truth I had denied. My father's love had never been absent. It had been steady, persistent, patient. I had simply been too blinded by resentment to recognize it. Now, sitting across from him, I saw clearly. And what I saw was devotion, not loud, not perfect, but real. As winter turned to spring, I grew stronger. My limp faded, my energy returned. Friends began to invite me out again, and I accepted, cautious but hopeful. But no matter where I went, I carried him with me, not just his presence in my apartment, but his presence in my heart. For the first time in years, I wanted him there, wanted him to see the life I was rebuilding. I invited him to dinner with friends, and though he was shy at first, he told stories that had everyone laughing. I watched him that night, and pride swelled in me. Not shame, not embarrassment. Pride. The bridge was no longer fragile. It was strong, built from honesty and humility, from pain and persistence. And as I leaned into its strength, I realized that bridges are not just about crossing distances. They are about connection, about choosing to meet in the middle, again and again. My father and I had chosen, and that choice had changed everything. Life rarely gives us clean endings. More often, it offers turning points, moments when the story shifts, when the pieces you thought were scattered forever find a way to fit again. For me, the accident had been that turning point. But Chapter 7 of my journey was not about broken bones or hospital rooms. It was about redefining what it meant to be a daughter and what it meant to have a father. By the time spring turned into summer, my body was almost whole again. The limp that had once embarrassed me softened until it was barely noticeable. The cane that had leaned against the wall now gathered dust in the corner. I could climb stairs without wincing, stand long enough to cook a meal, walk down the block without fear. But even as my body healed, I realized the deeper recovery was happening in my heart. Each day spent with him had shifted something inside me, loosening resentment, making space for forgiveness, for recognition, for love. We began to build new rituals, not born of necessity but of choice. Saturday mornings became our time for breakfast at the diner down the street. He always ordered black coffee and eggs over easy. I tried different things each week, teasing him for his predictability. "Why not change it up?" I'd ask, spearing a bite of pancake. He'd grin, shrug, and say, "Why change what works?" It became a joke between us, but beneath it lay something deeper, a truth about who he was. He didn't chase novelty. He valued consistency, and maybe that was what I had misunderstood all along. His love had never been about grand gestures. It had been about showing up the same way every time. We also started taking walks at the park, the air warm with summer, children running past with kites and ice cream cones. He walked slowly, his knees stiff, but he never complained. We sat on benches, watching the ducks, sometimes talking, sometimes not. And I realized silence with him no longer felt empty. It felt full of history, of presence, of all the words that didn't need to be said. It was during one of those walks that I asked him something that had lingered in my chest for years. "Did you ever think I didn't love you?" He paused, his gaze on the pond, the ripples spreading from a stone someone had tossed. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I figured love's not always loud. I hoped you'd come around one day." His voice was steady, not accusing. I felt tears sting my eyes. For so long, I had assumed he didn't care, but the truth was he had been waiting, patiently, quietly, for me to see. And I had, finally. That night, I pulled out the old photo albums I had ignored for years. Together, we flipped through pages of my childhood, the county fair where I sat on his shoulders, the science project he had helped me glue together, the Christmas mornings when Mom's laughter filled the room. The photos told a different story than the one I had carried. They told of a man who had always been there, even if imperfectly. A man who had loved me in the ways he knew how. I leaned against him, and for the first time in years, I felt the kind of safety I had once taken for granted as a child. But rebuilding bridges also meant facing the truth about time. He was older now, his hair grayer, his body slower. There were mornings when his hands shook too much to hold the paper steady, evenings when he rubbed his chest with a pained expression before brushing it off. The realization hit me with a force I hadn't expected. I wouldn't have him forever. I had wasted years in resentment, years I could never get back, but I still had now, and I vowed not to waste it. We began to talk about the future, not in grand plans, but in small hopes. He wanted to fix up the old truck in the garage, the one he had started before Mom died. I offered to help, even though my mechanical skills were laughable. He grinned, patient as ever, teaching me how to hold a wrench, how to listen to the hum of an engine. I teased him when I dropped tools, and he teased me back. But beneath the laughter was something profound. We were building not just a truck, but a memory. A bridge forward, not just backward. One evening, after hours spent covered in grease, we sat on the porch, watching the stars blink awake. The radio he had fixed for me played softly in the background, a song Mom used to hum. I turned to him and said, "Thank you for staying, for not giving up on me even when I gave up on you." His eyes glistened, though he blinked the tears away. "Always, kiddo," he said. 2 words, but they carried the weight of everything we had rebuilt. As summer deepened, I realized that my definition of strength had changed. Once I thought strength meant independence, cutting ties, proving I didn't need anyone. Now, I understood strength meant vulnerability, allowing myself to need him, to love him, to admit I had been wrong. It meant forgiving, not because the past didn't hurt, but because love was bigger than hurt. When fall came, golden leaves scattering across the sidewalks, we took a drive out to the coast. The ocean roared against the rocks, endless and wild. We stood together on the cliff, the wind tugging at our jackets. "Funny thing about waves," he said, his eyes on the horizon. "They keep coming no matter what. Doesn't matter if you're ready or not." I looked at him, realizing he wasn't just talking about the sea. He was talking about life, about loss, about love. And he was right. The waves had kept coming for us, but we had learned, finally, to face them together. The accident had almost taken me away, but in some strange way, it had given me back more than it had stolen. It had given me my father. Not the version I had resented, not the version I had erased, but the real man. The one who loved silently, persistently, imperfectly, and completely. And it had given me the chance to love him back. As I write this, I think about how many of us carry stories about our parents that are incomplete, distorted by resentment or misunderstanding. We hold on to hurts, forgetting the small devotions that were there all along. We judge them for not loving us the way we wanted, instead of recognizing the love they gave in the only way they knew how. And sometimes it takes a turning point, an accident, a loss, a moment of vulnerability to finally see the truth. For me, that truth is simple. My father never stopped loving me. He just loved in silence, in work, in devotion. And I, blinded by pride, had failed to see it. Now I do, and it has changed everything. So this is where my story pauses, not with resentment, but with gratitude. Gratitude for a father who showed up when I thought no one would. Gratitude for the bridge we rebuilt, plank by plank. Gratitude for the devotion that was always there, waiting for me to notice. And if you're listening, if you're carrying your own unfinished story with a parent or someone you've pushed away, I hope my journey gives you courage. Courage to look again, to listen differently, to see love where you thought there was only absence. Because sometimes, the people we think we've lost have been waiting all along, steady and silent, ready to cross the bridge with us. At this point, I want to speak directly to you, the one who has walked alongside me through this story. Thank you for listening, for spending your time journeying with Olivia and her father through the path from resentment to forgiveness, from distance to reunion. I wish you and your family good health, peace, and the kind of connection that can be found in life's seemingly small, but truly profound moments. If this story has touched you, I invite you to consider subscribing to the channel, not just to hear the next story, but to join in nurturing the values of family, forgiveness, and enduring love. I look forward to meeting you again on the next journey.